The laughter began the day Daniel Mercer carried a bed frame through the smokehouse door. People driving past the old Hollow Creek Road slowed their wagons and stared. Not because anyone had entered the abandoned smokehouse in years. Because nobody understood why anyone would. The building sat nearly a mile beyond town, where forest met frozen pasture. Thick brick walls blackened by age rose beneath a steep roof covered in moss and snow. Rusted hooks still hung from heavy ceiling beams inside, while old smoke stains darkened nearly every surface. Children avoided it. Hunters used it as a landmark. Most people forgot it even existed. Until Daniel moved in. Then suddenly everyone remembered. A smokehouse. You planning to live beside hams and sausages? Man finally froze his brain before winter even started. Harlan Pike laughed hardest. He stood outside the trading post shaking his head while others gathered nearby. He moved into a giant meat oven. The name spread immediately. Mercer's Meat House. Children repeated it whenever Daniel passed. Adults repeated it because they thought it was funny. Daniel ignored all of them. Because unlike everyone else in Hollow Creek, Daniel wasn't seeing a smokehouse. He was seeing brick. Massive brick. That mattered. 3 years earlier Daniel worked rail construction farther east, where crews often repaired old industrial buildings during winter. One thing fascinated him almost immediately. Brick behaved differently. Workers lit furnaces inside some structures for several hours each evening. Then long after the fires burned down, warmth remained. Walls released heat slowly, almost lazily, as if they refused to let it disappear quickly. The effect stayed in Daniel's mind, especially after the winter before nearly ruined him. His cabin looked sturdy enough from outside. Proper roof, strong walls, stone chimney. Yet every night winter somehow stole everything. Fire roared for hours. Morning still arrived freezing. Cold seeped through walls. Drafts crept beneath floors. The stove demanded wood constantly. More wood. Always more wood. Daniel remembered waking one January morning with ice forming inside the windows despite feeding the stove before sleeping. He remembered sitting there wrapped in blankets wondering how a building full of heat could still feel cold. Then spring arrived. Then summer. Then opportunity. The old smokehouse went up for sale. Nobody wanted it. The structure originally cured meat for ranches decades earlier. Thick brick walls surrounded a compact central chamber designed specifically to trap smoke and maintain steady temperatures. Steady. That word caught Daniel immediately. Because winter wasn't usually about heat. It was about stability. So he bought it. Cheap. Very cheap. People assumed he planned to tear it down. Until wagons started arriving. Beds. Chairs. Food. Tools. Blankets. Everything. Then the laughter started all over again. Caleb Turner visited first after hearing rumors. He expected madness. Instead, he found Daniel standing inside the smokehouse removing rusted iron hooks from ceiling beams. Caleb stopped in the doorway. Because the place looked strange. Very strange. The brick walls were enormous. Far thicker than ordinary cabins. Small, narrow windows set deeply recessed within the structure, while soot-blackened surfaces stretched toward heavy ceiling beams overhead. What exactly are you doing? Daniel pulled another hook free. Moving in. Caleb stared. No, seriously. Daniel smiled. Seriously. Caleb walked slowly around the room. You can't live in a smokehouse. Daniel brushed dust from his gloves. Why? Caleb looked around uncertainly. Because it's a smokehouse. Daniel laughed softly. That answer perfectly explained the problem. People saw purpose before possibility. The building had cured meat before, so they believed curing meat was all it could ever do. Daniel saw something different. The walls. Always the walls. Construction continued through summer and into early autumn. Daniel didn't change the smokehouse completely. He adapted it. Small insulated living sections went inside the main structure. Shelves-lined walls. Storage-filled corners. A modest stove replaced the old smoking pit near the center. Most importantly, Daniel left the brick exposed. Caleb noticed during another visit. He stood watching Daniel finish interior work and frowned. You aren't covering the walls? Daniel shook his head. No. Why? Daniel walked over and knocked gently against the brick. Solid. Heavy. These are helping. Caleb pressed his hand against the wall. Cold. Very cold. They don't feel helpful. Daniel smiled. Not yet. Then he explained. Thin walls change temperature quickly. Heavy materials change slowly. The stove wouldn't only warm air. It would warm the bricks. The bricks would slowly store energy throughout the day. Then during the night, they would release it back into the room. Not suddenly. Gradually. Like heat saved for later. Caleb still looked doubtful. So your walls become a stove? Daniel laughed. When you say it like that, I sound crazy. That didn't help. The jokes continued through autumn. Children asked whether Daniel planned on smoking himself next. Harlan asked if he intended to hang blankets from meat hooks. Even Caleb remained uncertain. Because from outside the place still looked ridiculous. By late November the smokehouse stood complete. Warm lantern light glowed through narrow windows, while smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Inside felt surprisingly comfortable. Smaller than a cabin, but heavier somehow. Calmer. The first freeze arrived early. Northern winds swept across Hollow Creek, carrying hard temperatures behind them. Families prepared normally. More wood. More blankets. More repairs. Daniel watched carefully, especially after lighting the stove. The first changes appeared after only several nights. Heat behaved differently. The room warmed normally while the stove burned. But later, hours later, warmth remained. Not strong warmth. Steady warmth. The bricks absorbed heat through the day and quietly released it back through the night. Morning temperatures barely changed. Daniel noticed immediately. Then Caleb noticed too. He stepped inside one evening carrying grain sacks and frowned. The stove held only a few glowing coals. Yet the room still felt comfortable. How much wood are you burning? Daniel looked up. Less. Caleb stared around slowly. That shouldn't happen. Daniel tapped one soot-darkened brick wall beside him. The walls remembered. Caleb frowned. The walls what? Daniel smiled faintly. The walls remembered the fire. Outside Hollow Creek prepared for winter. Then December arrived. And strange weather arrived with it. Pressure dropped quickly. Birds disappeared. Old ranchers stopped smiling. Stories spread about brutal cold moving south through the mountains. Daniel looked toward the northern sky one evening, then quietly began moving extra supplies inside. 3 nights later, the snow started falling. The snow started falling quietly. Soft flakes drifted across Hollow Creek, while smoke rose from chimneys, and children still ran through the roads, chasing each other beneath gray skies. Nobody worried at first. Early snow meant little. Winter always began gently. Then temperatures dropped. Fast. Water troughs froze solid overnight. Tree limbs cracked sharply in distant forests. Ice formed along cabin windows before sunrise. Old ranchers stopped talking. That frightened people more than weather itself. Because old ranchers had survived everything. If they looked worried, everyone noticed. 3 days later the wind arrived. Deep mountain wind carrying cold so sharp it felt almost alive. Shutters rattled. Loose boards slammed against walls. Smoke flattened low across rooftops instead of rising upward. And by nightfall, Hollow Creek disappeared. Snow blasted sideways hard enough to erase buildings beyond a few yards. Fence lines vanished. Roads vanished. Entire sections of town vanished beneath moving white walls. Inside the old smokehouse, Daniel sat quietly beside the stove listening. Not to the storm, to the building. Cabins always complained under pressure. Timbers groaned. Windows rattled. Weak joints shifted. The smokehouse barely made a sound. Wind struck brick, then disappeared. That unsettled Daniel more than if the structure shook violently. Because it felt as though the storm simply didn't matter. Hours passed. Snow piled higher. The stove burned steadily near the center of the room. Not roaring. Not struggling. Steady. Then Daniel noticed something strange. The fire had grown smaller. Very small. Only glowing coals remained. Yet warmth still surrounded him. He stood and pressed his palm against the nearest brick wall. Not hot, but not cold either. The bricks had spent days absorbing warmth from regular fires. Now they released it quietly back into the room. The entire building had become one enormous heat battery. Then came pounding at the door. Daniel opened it against screaming wind and nearly lost his footing immediately. Caleb Turner stumbled inside, carrying his younger brother beneath blankets. Snow exploded across the floor before Daniel forced the door shut again. For several moments Caleb simply stood, breathing heavily. Then he looked around. The fire barely glowed. Yet the room felt comfortable. How? He asked quietly. Daniel handed blankets toward his brother. The walls are working now. Caleb stared. Then another knock came. And another. Harlan Pike arrived with his wife after snow collapsed part of their roof. Mrs. Tolland appeared carrying her grandson. Then came the Millers. By midnight, nearly a dozen people crowded inside Daniel's strange smokehouse home. Nobody laughed anymore. Outside, the storm became monstrous. Snow buried windows. Wind forced itself through cracks in ordinary cabins faster than fires could replace lost warmth. People struggled constantly to keep rooms warm. Inside the smokehouse, something different happened. The temperature barely changed. Hours passed. The stove consumed little wood. Still warmth remained, because every brick surrounding them slowly released stored heat back into the room. Not dramatically, steadily, like sunlight trapped inside stone. Harlan finally walked toward one wall and pressed both hands against it. His eyes narrowed. "It isn't freezing." Daniel nodded. "No, but it should be." Daniel smiled faintly. "That brick's thicker than most cabin walls." Silence followed, because everyone suddenly understood. The walls themselves had become part of the heating system, not through fire, through storage. The storm continued for 3 days. 3 endless days of screaming wind and drifting snow. Inside the smokehouse, children slept comfortably beneath blankets while adults sat around lantern light listening to weather they could barely hear through the walls. The structure simply endured, not fighting winter, outlasting it. Emma Miller noticed first on the second night. She looked toward the stove and frowned. "Mr. Mercer?" Daniel looked over. "Yes. The fire keeps getting smaller." Daniel smiled. "It does." She looked around. "But we're still warm." Daniel glanced toward the walls. "Because the room remembers." She didn't understand. Neither did most adults. But Caleb did. He looked slowly around the structure, then at Daniel. All this time, Daniel raised an eyebrow. Caleb shook his head. "We thought surviving winter meant building bigger fires." Daniel added another small log to the glowing coals. "No." Everyone looked toward him. "It means keeping warmth from escaping." Outside, winter kept attacking. Inside, winter kept losing. Because every hour the smokehouse resisted sudden temperature changes naturally. Thin cabins cooled quickly. Brick cooled slowly. Very slowly. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. By the 4th morning, the storm finally weakened. Daniel opened the heavy door carefully. Nobody moved behind him, because people suddenly felt afraid to see what remained. Outside, Hollow Creek looked broken. Snow buried fences completely. Several cabin roofs had collapsed. One chimney lay shattered across the road. Sheds disappeared beneath drifts. But the old smokehouse still stood exactly where it always had. Snow covered parts of the roof. Smoke rose quietly into pale morning light. The brick walls looked untouched. Word spread through Hollow Creek immediately after roads reopened. People climbed the smokehouse hill simply to see it. They expected hidden furnaces, massive fires, secret machines buried beneath the floor. Instead, they found ordinary rooms inside extraordinary walls. Questions came quickly. Would brick work in cabins? Could stone help too? How thick should walls be? Daniel answered patiently, because winter already explained better than he ever could. By spring, families began changing their homes. Thicker interior walls, heat-retaining materials, smaller insulated rooms. Nobody called it Mercer's meat house anymore. The storm ended that permanently. One evening, Caleb stood outside watching sunset strike the smokehouse bricks with orange light. "You know what bothers people most now?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "What?" Caleb looked toward the old building. "They laugh because they thought you moved into a place meant for preserving meat." He paused, then smiled. "Turns out you moved into a place built for preserving heat."